That's me, lens flare. I'm Andrew Denman, and I'm going to be talking to you about my work, but within the context of a broader topic, which is contemporary wildlife art. So I thought this would be an appropriate thing to talk about because within this group of artists, there are people that I consider to be contemporary wildlife artists. And I should clarify, I realize that those of us who are artists in this room who are alive are, of course, contemporary because we're living. And so I know it's a little bit of a clunky term, but for the sake of being able to talk about what I consider to be sort of a subset of the broader picture of wildlife art, I'm going to use this term for its convenience. But to begin with, I want to talk about a little bit about wildlife art and its beginnings. And Amy touched on this really beautifully. But I'm speaking, I should clarify, I'm speaking specifically about painting. Because particularly when it comes to the influence of the contemporary, the story of how that happens in sculpture is actually very different from how it happens in painting. So I'm going to talk about painting in particular. So, it's interesting because, as Amy said, wildlife has been with us as a subject for art and symbology for a very, very long time. But wildlife art as sort of a group, a movement, a community is something that's not that old, that really begins with science illustration, sporting art, and into the middle of the 20th century, what I refer to as sort of an ecological art, which is where artists begin painting an animal in its environment, behaving naturally, but without the sporting component. There's no one, it's not necessarily an animal that anyone is intending to shoot or hunt. It's simply the animal painted for the animal's sake and to tell you a story about it, this sort of narrative that Dustin was talking about. What all of these things have in common is a documentarian aspect. And that notion of going out and recording, seeing, and sharing what we've seen. And again, I think that's something that whatever style we're working in as artists, whether it's more traditional, more contemporary, or something in between, whatever traditional and contemporary mean, frankly, that we're always trying to share an experience that we've had and give it to other people. But for most of the history of wildlife art, again, as a community, a group of artists, I hesitate to call it a genre because it's really a subject choice that transcends a lot of different genres. The narrative has typically been a natural historical narrative. Not always, certainly, but typically it has been. So what do I talk about when I'm talking about contemporary wildlife art? Well, the shorthand is I'm simply talking about people who paint wildlife, but who paint wildlife introducing elements that typically the broader art world considers as belonging to contemporary or modern art. So we're talking about things like abstraction, like in this piece, elements in the background, for instance, that do not correspond to an objective reality. This is nuthatches like doilies. They might. Stylization, which we should distinguish from abstraction in that the subject matter is still recognizable, but elements of it are drawn out, pulled, pushed into less representational forms, but they're still representational in that they're still representing a subject. So for instance, the stylization of the leaves and the bulb on this amaryllis, which sort of explode into kind of an Art Nouveau treatment in this painting of mine. Flatness and pattern is a big one. This is part of my modern camouflage series, and I'm going to be talking about that a lot more later on. Non-objective space and color. This is another really huge one, and something that I think really distinguishes certain artists within the wildlife art movement from others, the contemporary from the non-contemporary, and that is the removal of an animal subject from its natural environment and the recontextualizing of that animal subject. So taking an animal out of the space that we know it in and presenting it in a different environment forces the viewer to consider the animal subject in a different light. Another way to recontextualize is with non-objective color. So this is the blue bunny. And again, we know bunnies aren't blue, but when you take an animal subject and you change something, you torque something like color, again, it causes the viewer to look at that animal in a different light. And one of the things that first of all, I want to make very sure that as I'm talking about this, I'm speaking about where my experiences have led me and what I like to focus on in my art, not to denigrate artists who are working in what I consider to be a more traditional wildlife art paradigm, because it's that wildlife art that caused me initially to fall in love with wildlife art. And many of the artists who are sitting here represent that. Many of the artists sitting here represent people that I think are more part of my sub-movement. But that's probably I liked when Amy said it's not really up to her to call what she does anything in particular, because that's something someone else will do later on. So who knows whether the moniker contemporary wildlife art will hold. It probably won't. But looking back, someone will decide how to group us all and categorize. But so all art has a concept, of course. But just as you'll notice it in sort of, you go into a modern art museum, if you go to the Tate Modern, there's a dramatic emphasis on concept. Sometimes, I think, to the extent that everything else is sacrificed in favor of concept, like craft, or it being attractive, which is something I try to avoid. But nonetheless, all of my work, the concept is something that is always very paramount. There's a narrative, there's a story behind the piece, but instead of a natural historical narrative that's so much about the animal, however much the animal was integral to the original inspiration, the narrative is more about the manner in which I painted and something internal that's happening in me. In this case, this particular painting is really about the act of painting. You know, the tiger, you can't really see it in this image, is half of it's a pencil drawing, half of it's a finished painting. It's walking through a bunch of paint cans. The colors are bleeding up into the animal. The tail of the peacock is turning into paint chips. This was a commission, so every one of the colors is named for something personally relevant to every member of the family of the commissioner. It was a really cool piece. But there's a big story happening there. So that notion of concept as being a paramount element is, I think, really important to me personally, but also important within the broader context of what I'm going to, again, refer to as contemporary wildlife art. So my career started really, really early. From the time I was 13 years old, I started going into Pacific wildlife galleries in Lafayette, California, and hassling the owner to show my work. And at that age, that wasn't going to happen. And Dennis Salva, who owned that gallery, was an absurdly laconic figure. He didn't like to talk a lot. And rather than the lavish praise that I was getting heaped on me at the time as, you know, the art guy in my small town that I grew up in, I got sort of like, kind of nods. And that really, it was exactly what I needed, because I'd go back and I'd show more work and I'd get a slightly more encouraging nod, and I'd go back to where I might get a you know, and then eventually, by the time I was 16, I actually had paintings on the wall. Paintings on the wall hanging next to Bob Bateman's, Carl Brender's, John Street Lester. So I was 16 at that time, and I was hanging with the people that I've been looking at their books since I was a little kid. So it was a really heady time for me. This is me in my first show, my first one-man show at that gallery, which was like 5 months after I got my Bachelor of Fine Arts. So I was 21, I think, 20 or 21. So being surrounded by all these artists and having met people like John and Bob from a very, very young age, you know, all of whom I stay in touch with, many of whom I consider to be mentors, a lot of the artists that I exhibited with at Pacific Wildlife Galleries, it's no wonder that my earliest forays into wildlife art were very much within that paradigm of mid to late 20th century ecological wildlife art, animal in environment behaving naturally. But I was also young, and I was experimental, and I was in college, and I was trying lots of different things, and I was really tickled to hear Dustin talk about fantasy art, because that was one of my first loves as well. I went through a whole, you know, monster, dragon, dinosaur phase, so I was doing lots of different things. And I had a real breakthrough when I was in college. This is before they told me that I could just be on independent study and do whatever I wanted to do, where we were asked to do a knife painting, and I'd never done an impasto work at all. I never used a palette knife before except to mix paint. So I did this big, scratchy, sloppy knife painting, which everyone else oohed over and I thought was crap. And at the time, they were really emphasizing, at the college I was at, it was a small Catholic liberal arts college, St. Mary's in Moraga, California, they really emphasized doing things like building your own canvases from scratch. So I had a lot of work just in this canvas. I didn't want to throw it away, but I was used to painting on a flat surface. I don't know why it didn't occur to me to just remove the canvas and put new canvas on, but it didn't. So what I did instead was I took a whole bunch of gesso and I coated over this heavy, gloppy canvas and did coat after coat after coat until I sort of filled in some of the cracks and valleys. And I thought, I'm just going to sand this puppy smooth, sand down all the ridges and then even it out. And what happened when I did that is that I got this field of white with all these beautiful dark patterns emerging from it as I sanded down those ridges. I thought it was really evocative. It was very abstract. Kind of looked like when you look out the wing of a plane flying over the Rockies and you see the little black ridges emerging through the snow. I glazed over it with a bunch of color transparently so you could still see all the patterns and plunked a bird in the middle of it. The effect was sort of like a bird flying through a nebula. And that was the very first of my Resurrection of Flight series, so-called because it was sort of like giving new life to what I considered to be a bad painting. And for many years, anytime I felt like I really botched something, I would just throw a bunch of whatever extra paint I had at that board, gesso over it, sand it down, and whatever that gave me, my job was to sort of find a way to make that work as a non-objective space in which to house a bird in flight. So this was the fifth and last of the Resurrection of Flight series. That notion of applying really thick impasto paint, gessoing over it and sanding it down is something that at that time I didn't know would become integral to my artistic process, and is now probably accounts for about 80 to 85% of every painting is done in that manner. And now it's done in a very controlled, directed way, but it still has very much the same sort of happy accident quality that watercolor has, where there's certain things between that, applying it, painting over it, sanding it down, all sorts of things happen that I have very little control over, which is why it's exciting to do. So this piece I'm going to show you, this is called Indigo. This is a big painting of Indian blue peafowl, and this is a breakthrough piece for me. I think it was from 2002. Because this was the very first piece where I didn't just use this technique for an abstract or non-objective background. I allowed for that treatment to bleed over into the animal subjects themselves. So the central peacock is very realistic, except for the tail, which bleeds into this stylization and abstraction. And the peacock in the back, when you cut the head off, it almost doesn't resemble a peacock at all. Yet within the context of the painting, it does. So I could talk to you a whole lot about my process, and I actually really thought about doing like a time-lapse thing, and I just really trying not to laugh when Dustin was talking about that, because like I had the exact same experience. You record like the blocking area, like this is really cool, it looks so awesome. And you're like, how do I film myself working on this for the next 80 hours? Like how? Like it's watching paint dry. So and moreover, I feel like to a certain extent, as much as like my process is very personal and I love it and I don't mind sharing how I work. And if you want to see videos of me plotting away on things, you can find them on my YouTube channel. Knock yourself out. I'm working on a couple more at the moment actually that I'm going to post soon. I enjoy doing that, but talking to you here now, I feel like it's just so much more important to talk about ideas than it is about the physical process of hashing out a painting. So art history from the mid-late 1800s to the 20th century, one of the biggest questions that happens within that context is this one. Is the canvas a window or a wall? Do we as artists treat the canvas or the board or whatever you're working on with Renaissance perspective as a space to be credibly entered into, a window on the world, as in this fairly old landscape painting of mine? Or do we treat it as a flat surface to be decorated? And this is a detail of one of my modern camouflage pieces. I know it looks like wallpaper, and yes, that is the point. So this story kind of begins, it's a long story, but it really starts with Manet. This is the famous Luncheon on the Grass. Sorry, there should be a date up there. It's 1862, I believe. So Manet is one of the first artists that really starts to eschew Renaissance perspective. This painting was panned at the time it was first exhibited because it was considered to be sort of a hodgepodge, like he had pasted together a bunch of different elements. The perspective doesn't really work. The gentlemen's coats are just sort of these black voids. They look very flat. The depth with the figure in the background doesn't quite make sense. There's too much space for it to be that big. All these things are deliberate, and Manet particularly is trying to play with the sense of depth and your expectation of depth on what is effectively a flat surface. This is Matisse's The Red Studio from 1911, and this is where you really start to see this notion of the treatment of the board or the canvas as flat really coalescing. There is, in the line, in the drawing work, some suggestion of perspective and the depth of the room, but it's obliterated by the painting of the entire thing in one color, and that's very deliberate. Matisse was being inspired by Persian miniatures in particular at this time. Now, of course, I'm giving a very, very brief history of kind of how this notion, this conflict within art started, and I don't want to make this an art history lesson, but we can just say that this moves forward into things like abstract expressionism, minimalism, none of which would have been possible without some of these early artists first just barely showing you that they're playing with this notion of flatness. So curiously, one of the areas in art that inspired me to explore this on my own terms were the American Trompe-l'oeil painters like William Harnett, John Haverly, John F. Pageau. This is one of the After the Hunt paintings by Harnett from 1884. And what really intrigued me about these pieces, I mean, first of all, I encountered these when I was in 5th grade. I had a great 5th grade teacher who introduced us to a different American artist every week. And I saw a huge Harnett retrospective at the de Young Museum in San Francisco when I was in my early teens, I think, and I never forgot it. And you know, the magic of these artists painting ordinary objects, their actual size, so as to convince you that you were looking at the actual object itself in real space, not a representation of the object. It's sort of the ultimate in illusionism. But what really intrigued me is that one of the things that these artists did is that they painted very shallow depth of field, so that when you enter a room and you look at, say, a painting of a landscape, as you turn and shift, you can obviously tell it's a flat surface because the perspective distorts as you walk around it. Less so when the artist is only trying to convince you that you're seeing a couple of inches or at most a foot of depth. So, ironically, the most convincing illusions of depth created by the Trompe-l'oeil artists were reliant upon a very convincing duplication of surface, a door, a bulletin board, a letter rack. So then I thought to myself, well, what if I painted an abstract painting, a color-filled painting, and then layered on top of it objects, which again I would paint in Trompe-l'oeil detail complete with cast shadows, and in so doing, paradoxically reassert the abstract painting, the ultimate in treatment of the surface as flat, as an illusionistic surface within a perceptible depth range. And so I just thought, that's a cool concept. I can get some paintings out of that. So I did a whole series of these. This is actually the very last of those still life paintings. But that was just a concept that really intrigued me. And I talk about it now because it sort of brings us to one of the things I'm really focusing on today. So Gertrude Stein once said, "There is no repetition, there is only insistence," which is a line that I really, really like. And you have to keep that in mind if you actually read any Gertrude Stein, because you'll go crazy if you don't. So this is part of my, what I call my modern camouflage series. So I had this idea in my head for maybe 2 or 3 years of owls emerging from wallpaper. And I was hesitant to start it because my problem was, well, how is it not going to be jarring to have realistically painted owls and then this completely flat surface? How do they integrate? How do they work together? And what I eventually realized was that the very fact that they don't is the point, and that where they do, it can be done in a very minimal way. So in these paintings, you can see in this detail, there's just the tiniest little area where there's a suggestion of a shadow on the flat pattern, or a claw curling around it, or actually, like, there's a little bit of a cast shadow there. So just a few inches to the left or right, this pattern becomes exactly what it is, which is a completely flat pattern. But somehow the flat surface is animated by its juxtaposition with the illusionistically treated elements. So that idea really intrigued me. And bringing it forward to what I'm working on at present, this notion of pattern is something that is one that you'll see a lot of in pop art and op art. And oddly, I don't actually like pop art or op art. but they've been so prevalent in our society, they've had such an impact, they've worked their way into me, and I'm finding my own way to express some of these ideas in a way that I think is more pleasing than, for instance, Andy Warhol's immortal soup cans, but you gotta give the guy credit. We're still looking at it today, and they're Camel soup cans. So this is another piece. This is a Wayne Thiebaud, Folsom Street Fair Cake. He did a lot of these very regimented paintings of desserts primarily. And what these pieces share in common is this using an artistic medium to express and to explore commerciality, repetition. This really intrigues me. And then moving it on to a slightly different level, I was really, really excited that Amy talked quite a bit about sort of animal symbology. These are all common logos that we see that appropriate animal imagery. There's a really interesting book that I read not long ago by Carol Jung called Naming Nature, and it's basically about the history of binomial nomenclature, which sounds really dry, but it's not. So, so basically, yeah. So that system of Latin naming, prior to that, every community, from Aboriginal tribes to people living in the jungles of the rainforests in South and Central America, they had what are referred to as folk taxonomies. So if you lived within a small patch of forest, say a few hundred acres, you knew the names, they were your names, but you knew them nonetheless, of every plant and animal in your immediate area. You knew what you could eat, you knew you couldn't eat, you knew it could eat you, you know what tasted good, you knew it was gross, you knew what you could use for skins, all of that. Very detailed information. So binomial nomenclature is necessitated by, originally like Captain Cook bringing stuff from all over the globe, and suddenly your understanding of birds exploded from birds that are in my backyard to similar birds that exist all over the world, to different birds. How do I categorize those? How do I put them together? We needed a system to do that. But originally you didn't have a system, you just had your own folk understanding. And the reason that the nomenclature is necessary is because it's fairly scientifically well documented that there's actually a limited amount of dedicated brain space to names of things. We can keep in our brain with immediate recall some, I don't quote me on this, but I think it's somewhere around 2,000 names of things. And what's happened is that as we have disassociated ourselves from nature, as we've pulled ourselves away from nature, we're not really keeping these folk taxonomies in our brains because we don't need to, because you're not encountering things that can kill you and that you need to eat and you need to know what's poisonous every day. Instead, our heads are being filled up with brand names, logos, this kind of imagery, or worse, these horrible little icons in our phones. And as you can see up here, I'm looking at 2 of these that still have the barest resemblance to something that is an actual objective external reality. Most of these things are not. And I know this is going to make me sound terribly old, I'm only 40, but kids today, their brains, the brain space that was once dedicated to a knowledge of nature is now completely filled with this sort of abstracted, and it's worse too, because these are abstractions that stand for abstractions. How do you define Yahoo? And what are we using to describe Yahoo? A Y, which is also an abstraction. So it's something that I decided I need to explore that concept within art. So I did a show last year at Astoria Fine Art, which is my wonderful gallery that I'm really thrilled to be with here in Jackson Hole, called A Different Animal. And among the things I explored in that show were the notion of mass production, as in my chicken and egg series. I'm very obsessed with chickens. Ubiquity. Really fascinated by animals like ravens, for instance, that are around us all the time, so much so that they become sort of background noise. And you'll notice that there's a very deliberate sort of suggestion in the palette of Andy Warhol's soup cans in this raven. That's not accidental. I also think there's something flag-like about it. It's kind of like burgeoning. I don't know why, but I get that feeling, even though it's actually lavender blue and black and red instead of red, white, and blue, but you get the idea. Reproductive capacity. This piece this is a piece sort of exploring, it's called multiplication tables, and it's exploring the rabbit. And again, here we have also the non-objective color adding to this, bringing sort of allusions to the Christian Easter, or if you prefer the pagan Yastre, into the whole thing, this notion of death, life, rebirth, reawakening, etc., that in sort of a whimsical and cheeky way the rabbit represents. And right now, I've just shipped off a show to England where I'm exploring these same sort of topics of pattern and repetition, but with mostly British heritage livestock. So there's also a series I'm working on which kind of brings us right back to where I started with modern camouflage. These are both part of my string theory series. And I'm sort of playing around with, again, what are effectively flat color fields, kind of reminiscent of like a 1960s Barnett Newman zit painting. But the just barest points of contact between the recognizable animal subjects and these flat areas of color immediately takes two-dimensional shapes and colors and makes them alive and animate within three-dimensional space. And that to me is something that's really magical and exciting. And these are very deliberately stripped down paintings, but and because oftentimes less is more. But for any of you who know Randy Dutra, a dear friend of mine, he once said, I'll never forget it, they say that less is more, but sometimes less is less. So it is important within this context to be careful about how far you push lessness. So another thing that's really inspired me is religious imagery. So this is a piece by William Strutt from 1896, not a particularly well-known artist, but this is 100% his most well-known image. It pretty much made his career. An old lithograph of this painting hung in my grandparents' house when I was a kid. And this was, I can't emphasize how this was the most unkid-friendly house on the planet. You'd walk in there, and within minutes, my older brother and my grandpa would be playing cribbage. And all I would hear was of the clock. And I'm just sitting there like, what is there here for me? And the two things was the collection of red rose ceramic tea animals in a little curio cabinet, a plastic Noah's Ark, which was missing all of the animals, and this painting, which I would stare at for hours. I know my grandmother thought I was having some sort of religious experience with baby Jesus and the animals, but really I was just fascinated by the animals themselves and also by this in the background, which is actually like an angel, but I thought it was a dragon. I read these as like big ears in the mouth and smoke coming out, I don't know why. Anyway, so, but I thought about it, and this is really probably the very first experience that I had with wildlife art, with animals in the context of a painting. And then this you'll all recognize as Albrecht Durer's Immortal Young Hare, which is still considered one of the finest, very early explorations of an animal subject in painting. And of course, Durer was a religious painter. This is not a religious subject, but I think that he carries through the reverence he had for his religious subjects into the reverence he has for nature in this piece. And that's really what I want to talk about in this next little section. There's a sort of body of work I've done for a long time, which I refer to as animal icons. And this particular piece actually is part of the permanent collection here at the museum, and it's sort of my answer to Albrecht Durer's Young Hare. It's called Michelle's Magic Bunny, after a hike that I took with a friend of mine named Michelle, where we encountered this black-tailed jackrabbit that just sat there and posed for me. And as you know, jackrabbits don't do that. It was so bizarre, I was starting to think there was something wrong with it before it finally hopped off. But it was a very sort of spiritual, animal in the church of nature kind of experience. And I don't want to be glib about that because I'm very serious. But it was something that just demanded to be painted. This is a drawing where I'm sort of exploring sort of some of the notions of falcons in Egyptian iconography. This graphite Nero pencil with gold leaf. This was the sort of banner image for my national touring show, Modern Wild, which Dave Wagner put together a few years ago. And at the time, I was still teaching some teenage students, and I was really tickled when like a 12-year-old student came up to my studio and said, "Hey, I dig your crucified bird." I was like, "Yes, I'm communicating." This was a bird that had flown into the window, actually, of the gallery that represented me at the time, and I just thought it was something that was so beautiful that I needed to pay homage to it, and I chose to house it in this context, really as sort of positioning it as, suffering for our sins. The bird having the right to be there. It's the window that they wanted it should have been. And then this piece, which is called Icon, which I have not exhibited yet, but painted a couple years ago, where I come across this vervet monkey with infant when I was in Africa, and it was just such a poignant experience. I really wanted to share it, and felt that I needed to house it in a context that showed the kind of reverence I had for the experience. And in this piece, I feel like the little vervet infant sort of becomes a savior of an imperiled natural world. And I want to make it very clear with these pieces that I'm never intending to parody people's religious faith with these. I hope they come across as being as sensitive and serious as I intend them to be. What I'm doing instead is taking a shared cultural, religious, spiritual, visual language, something that's instantly recognizable, and using it as a tool to communicate the reverence that I feel for the animal subject. That's what these pieces are about. So what I've been focusing on lately, along with my pattern pieces, are totems. And again, this is another example of where there's a wonderful tradition in the American Pacific Northwest of using animals and stacking them in this way, but using them to communicate not so much information about the animal, but to use them as symbols for elements of ourselves, the way that we see ourselves. Do we associate with an eagle? Do we associate with a bear? Do we feel some kinship with the fox? These are the thoughts at play here. So this is a piece, a bronze by Tony Hochstetler called Stacked Frogs, which some of you may be familiar with. This is a piece by Peter Wojtak, who I really admire, but don't know personally, but he does a lot of these amazing sort of gravity-defying, tension-filled stacks of found objects, fruit and birds. And these two artists are really the ones that inspired me to pursue the Totem series, because I saw within these works artists who work very differently than I do, not just because they're sculptors, but just the look of their work is completely different from what I go for. But I love their work. I own a few Tonys. And I just thought this inspired me to, like, if they can reinterpret the totem and put it into a 20th century or 21st century context within wildlife art, so can I. So I decided to do that within the context of painting. So these assemblages of animals are obviously meant to be fantastical. They're meant to be a bit whimsical. They're meant to be a bit quirky. And again, I'm taking the animals out of their wild context and putting them into a very different context quite deliberately. Again, by taking something that is very commonplace and recognizable and recontextualizing it, I'm hoping that the viewer will appreciate the animal and look at it in a different light than they would otherwise. These are very labor-intensive pieces because although they are not intended to be realistic, they have their own sort of internal logic. This is my most recent one, which is called Teton Totem. I'm trying to sort of take all the animals that are most emblematic of the Tetons and stacking them again in this totem format. But trying to get the scale right in a piece like this, where I've never photographed any one of these animal subjects in the context of the other, was really, really challenging. And then, of course, every leg and every foot has to be completely redrawn because obviously I was photographing them on surfaces very different than each other's backs. And ultimately, these pieces are sort of meant to be commentaries on the sort of precarious state of ecosystems and environments, and they are taken out of those environments, again, to emphasize that point, that we're looking at them in sort of the context of our own lives. And again, I hope that, if you're looking at these stacked animal paintings, you can find yourself. Where do you fall in the stack? Are you the one on the bottom or the one on the top? Are you the one carrying everyone else or the one with the view? So in conclusion, if you'll forgive the visual symbology of the bird and momentum, I feel like contemporary wildlife art, or contemporary influence within wildlife art, is something that is really gaining momentum. At the time that I first started exhibiting really contemporary wildlife pieces in the early to mid 90s, I could count on one hand the artists that I was aware of working within wildlife art who were doing what I considered to be contemporary work, and most of them were sculptors. I could think of maybe 2 painters. And when I started showing, I got a lot more acceptance than I thought I would. But there's a difference between acceptance and applause. And I think what's happening now is that, particularly in the last 5 to 8 years, I'm really seeing a greater acceptance for and a greater popularity for contemporary aspects of wildlife art. And frankly, the National Museum of Wildlife Art is a big part of that. So I'm really, really pleased to see, I'm thrilled and honored to be a part of this collection, thrilled and honored to be a part of Western Visions, and to continue to see more and more pieces added to this collection, and more artists within Western Visions who are working in a paradigm that is distinctly different from, however, derived from, wildlife art and its beginnings. So with that, I'd just like to thank you for your attention, and turn things over.